Welcome everyone to FME Flow Fundamentals for Administrators. Today, in our second part of 2 parts in the series, we'll be covering management and optimization FAQs. Today, I'm joined by Richard, Matt, and Sienna, so I'll hand things over to Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard Mosley. I'm the technical support team lead for FME Flow, and with me is Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Nabor. I'm an FME Flow support specialist, so helping provide information and support and address challenges that people have in their FME Flow journey. Pass it to Sienna.
Hi, I'm Sienna. I'm a customer solutions specialist, so I work directly with customers to help them get the most value out of their FME deployment.
Fantastic. Okay, and on the back end, we also have Steve, Sinai, and Chris joining us in the questions tab there on the bottom right. So if you do have any questions whatsoever during the webinar, of course, we're covering today some FAQs that we feel would be most valuable to you on this subject. But if you think of any other questions that you would love the answer to in this topic, please do drop those in the questions tab. We have a couple polls coming up, so keep an eye on the polls tab. Share your emoji reactions with us during the webinar with that react button in the bottom middle. And then lastly, I'll just highlight the help button. So if you do have any audio or video issues, you can click that button for 4 simple steps. All right, and with that, I will pass things over to Richard for our agenda.
Great. So this is a continuation on from the previous webinar we had. So we'll do an introduction, a bit of background on what we did before. Talked about before, and then we're going to get into what does our admin do, what kind of responsibilities do we envision the admin might have, what are user roles, how can you utilize them. We're going to look at Workspace handoff between an author and an admin, what that might look like, how to maintain security, some administrative best practices, and then Sienna is going to jump in with some notifications and how to be informed when important events occur. Following that, we're going to go into emails, which ties into that. And then the last section Matt's going to present is going to be on optimizing and performance, dashboards, analytics, and then we're going to finish off with troubleshooting. And there'll be a Q&A period at the end of this. So if you have lots of questions, that's wonderful. We'd like them. This will be very high level. We're not going to go too deep into these topics. We have lots of links that you can use to find out more information about all these topics.
Yeah, and before we move on here, I will get our presenters to turn off their webcams just so we can save on some bandwidth as we dive into the webinar content here.
Great. So today, as we were saying, we're going to get into some tools and insights. We're going to help you maintain your server and make sure it's running at peak performance. So previously on the FAQs for Flow Admin webinar series, we talked about the platform. So the platform is FME Form and FME Flow. FME Form, where you author a workflow and you publish it up to FME Flow, where you can automate it, you can expand it, you can have triggers, you can have external actions, and you provide a lot more value to it. There's also a Flow hosted option where we host FME Flow for you if you're interested in that. Today, we're really going to be talking about FME Flow, and the central piece of that is automations, which allows you to respond to those triggers, orchestrate job, and then also allow you to push things out to other sources or back to the client. We talked about the architecture last time. We're not going to go into too much detail. Please see the other webinar if you want to go into more detail. But the main thing we want to focus on is the engine. There's a whole bunch of periphery around it. The engine processes the job, and the rest of it controls how it's done. And then lastly, the recap of everything that we went through was the Flow engine types, the hardware requirements, FME and ArcGIS, HTTPS configuration, authentication types, and maintenance and expertise. So if you're interested in those topics, please take a look at the old webinar, and we're going to run off from that maintenance and expertise and really talk about what you need to do as an admin. But first, we have a poll.
Perfect.
So go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, so I just published that under the polls tab now. Feel free to go ahead, Richard, if you want to read it out there.
Sure. What's your role as an FME Flow administrator? So are you GIS? Are you IT? Something else? We're really curious because I think there's quite a range in what people are and who manages the FME Flow instances.
It looks like almost 3/4 of folks here today are under the camp of GIS professional. Is that what we'd expect here today, team?
Yeah, I think most of what my experience about that. I'd expect a few more IT, I think, but okay.
All right, we can move on. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so our first question here today is, who is your administrator and what do they manage? So I'll pass that to Richard.
Great. So there's a lot of things the administrator can do, and in different organizations, they administer different parts of it. But here's a bit of a diagram from last time, expanded on it. It shows the author. The author is the person who creates the workspace, maybe creates the automation, maybe creates the workspace app, deals with streams or schedules. And then the administrator comes in, and the administrator has a whole bunch of tasks to do that relate to that author task. So the user permissions, monitoring the system, engine management, security, DevOps, and troubleshooting. So some of these we're going to touch on. We're going to touch on system monitoring later in the webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about engine management, but we have other resources where you can go into that in more detail if you like. Security, user management, I'll cover a little bit here. DevOps processing is another webinar, so we'll have links to that. And then troubleshooting we'll finish up with today.
All right, and I'll pass this to Richard once again. The next question we have is, what are user roles?
So an FME role is a permission group for users, and people tend to use them in different ways, but some of the ways we can talk about using them here are use the built-in roles. We have roles that are shipped with FME. These are FME author role, user role, admin role, and these roles allow you to have a template that you can adjust or apply to your users that are coming in. So you can expand on that by importing a Active Directory group as a role and then apply one of those templates to it and adjust it as necessary. So it's very flexible in the way that you can apply those roles and permissions, and they can be very granular if you want. We really recommend you use roles opposed to using permissions on users, because it can be very hard if users join and leave. What permissions do you need? Where they're set in a role, it's easy to import, migrate, use a different authentication type. So roles really help you manage your server well. One of the last things that you can do, and it's up to the organization, is create project roles. So if you had automation coming in and you had many workspaces, many database and web connections, they'd all be together in one project, and then those users can be associated with it. So it doesn't have to be necessarily a user group from Active Directory, but can be an individual workflow that you're giving permissions to. The other thing on that side is to have good user procedures. So make sure everyone knows who's responsible for what part of it. So if you have an author and they publish to FME Flow, then maybe a policy is that author logs into the UI and gives his role permissions to the workspace, repositories, and connections that he's published. That can also be on the admin side, but I think you have to figure out these rules within your organization when you start, so you know who's responsible for what and what's being done. Good naming conventions are also important. They can help find duplicates if there's duplicates in database connections or web connections. Sometimes we get multiple of those published up to FME Flow, and it can cause some confusion. You can also have, this is where the admin can come in, and you can say everyone has to go through the admin to publish up. And that can also sort of refine things down. And you can say, all right, there is already a duplicate here, and you limit that bulking out of the FME flow.
All right, and our next question here. So what do I need in the Workspace handoff?
So we talked a bit about this already in terms of what the author does and what the administrator does. So in order for the administrator to schedule the engines, make sure that there's enough processing room there for the next job or next workflow, we need a few things from the author. So we need to know how long the job takes to run. We need to know this memory and CPU, how much will it consume. This is in the job log, so that could be one thing that you maybe publish up or give to the admin when you do the handoff, how frequently it'll run, who needs to run it or edit, and what dependencies are within it and who needs access to them. So are there packages or any other dependencies that it needs, or does it need to run on a specific engine? These are all scheduling things that fall under the admin. So that's some of the information that you might want to present in a handoff, or at least think about how you want to structure that policy within your organization.
Okay, and a couple more questions here for Richard. Our next being, how can I maintain the FME flow security?
So we have a webinar on security. If you're interested, you can dig into that. But a couple of key points from that are use the role-based access control. So that's what we've been talking about. Use those roles, set good policies and procedures, set system events to know when something's changed. Sienna will go into that later in more detail. Try to make sure that your system is up to date. So upgrade it, plan for frequent upgrades, and have an upgrade procedure. And lastly, we have the Trust Center, so go visit it. You can sign up for emails, notifications if any vulnerabilities are presented.
Okay, and lastly for Richard here, what are some administrative best practices that folks should know of?
Backup and restores are something we talk about a lot here on support, and one of the things that's changed in the last couple of versions is system encryption. It's really important to take a backup and move it to a different system in case your system fails, but also keep the corresponding system encryption key. Because if you don't have the key that matches, the backup won't work. So changing the encryption, your old backups won't work at all. It's just an important thing to mention. It's small, it's easy to do, but you have to be aware of it. And then system cleanup can be really important for a couple of reasons. Security, you don't want files up there that have been uploaded and sitting around for a long time. Performance, if you have a lot of data up there or in your engine results folder from data download processes, it can cause delays in your system. And then you have a lighter backup, which makes the upgrade process much easier. Pay attention to these system cleanups. Some are set in there by default. You can adjust them, but they make a big difference on very busy servers.
Okay, time for a poll here before we move on to Sienna. Thank you, Richard. So we'd love to know, what's your favorite or most used FME Flow feature? A few options there, and we do have the other option as well. If there's something else that comes to mind, you can chat that out. It looks like by far automations is the winner. And also neat to see we have about 15% of folks that haven't yet started using FME Flow. So definitely, yeah, learning opportunity there.
Yeah, I'd expect to see a few more picking the Flow apps as their favorite feature, but certainly the automations giving you the ability to schedule work off hours makes sense. And there's one Streams user. I'd love to meet that person.
Yeah.
Maybe let us know in the chat how you're currently using Streams. Be curious to know.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for voting. Close that out now and pass things over to Sienna here. So our first question for you, Sienna, is how can I be notified when an important event occurs?
Thanks, Elizabeth. So you can do this through system events. System events are like notifications on your phone, but instead, when you download a new app, automatically you'll be opted into a bunch of notifications automatically, and then you opt out of them. With system events, here it's more of an opt-in process. So anytime you want to be notified about something, you have to manually set that up, and I'll discuss how that's done. So before I begin, here's a few events you might want to take note of. So one is license to expire. This will tell you when your FME Flow license is about to expire. Low credits, these are your CPU engine credits. So if you have CPU engines, you might want to be notified when they're getting low. There is an error message logged system event. You might want to be notified by this, or you might not. This will generate a lot of noise, so you might want to filter out certain messages so you're not getting a message every time a job fails, or perhaps you do want to be notified every time a job fails. There's lots of different options here, and it depends on the admin, but it's definitely one to watch out for because you can get some really valuable information by those error messages. And then lastly, when a new repository item is published, I've heard people before want to be notified every single time a repository item, being a workspace, is published up to their FME Flow. Perhaps they want to share that workspace with other users within the same group or do something like that with it. So system events are a good place to start when you want to be notified about what's occurring on your system. So in the system events notifications, you can send yourself an email notification directly in the configuration for that system event. So on the top left-hand corner, I have exactly where you need to go to set everything up. But from your system event, you can click on the exact system event and set up this configuration to send yourself an email. Or you can use system events in automations. Before I talked about when you have an error message, perhaps you want to filter that error message. And you can do this within an automation. I have a link in these slides, which you can download these slides, click that link if you want to know more about how to set this up. But you can perhaps filter out different error messages that you're more or less interested in and send yourself an email based on that.
All right, our next question here is on emails. So how do I set up emails in FME Flow?
So emails in FME Flow, there's lots of places you could potentially use emails within FME Flow, but here are a few examples. Directly on the Run Workspace page, if you are on your interface right now, when you go to the Run Workspace page, there is an email results to variable that you could set and send yourself the results of your workspace once it's completed. You can also send emails within an automation. You can send emails from your system events and for the reset password functionality. So let's start with emails in automations. Here we have our email trigger. So there's two different types. There's IMAP and SMTP. What you use is all based on what's available for you. Typically, I see most commonly people use IMAP, where we're pulling an email server. So this could be something like a Gmail account, let's say once every 5 minutes, waiting for new data to arrive. And then in that automation, we can process that data. The other one we have is the email external action. So this will send yourself an email once the workspace has completed or once the previous action has completed. You can attach data directly within that email external action. Next, we have emails in the Run Workspace page. This is what I was talking about before, where you can set up an email here. So if I were to write my email in that little box, click OK, the workspace would say, OK, I'm going to run, and I'll send the data to that email directly. How do you do that? You need to use topics. If you're a newer user of FME Flow, you might have not heard of topics because they are a little old-fashioned. Topics are basically like internal notifications that FME Flow uses. The ones that you'll likely be interested in are the data download async topic or the job submitter async topic, just selecting it based on what service you're using. How does this work? So automatically within FME, we know to notify that topic. So as long as you have that email results to set to a value, we're going to go ahead, notify that topic. From there, in an automation, you can take that topic. There is a topic trigger within an automation, and you can pass along that data using these JSON values to your external action. And again, I have a link here, so you can go ahead and set that up once we're done the webinar. Finally, there is the system email, and it's natural to think that the system email will handle all emails on your FME Flow system, but it only really handles emails sent for system events or the reset password functionality. So you can go ahead, set up that system email, and then we'll help you if users want to reset their password or you want an email for a system event.
Okay, awesome. So our next question here is, how do I start optimizing performance?
All right, so when I started this question, I thought, wow, this could be a whole webinar, and it actually is a full webinar. So after this webinar, if you want to learn more, you can click on that link there and learn more about how to do this. It is a bit of an older webinar. It's from 2022, so we're using some different terminology, but the main points are still the same. So I'm going to give you a very high-level Coles notes of how to look at performance in FME Flow. But if you really want to dig deep, I'd highly recommend watching that webinar. So the first thing you could look at is if you could remove latency within your job. So let's say you have a job, it's running for a long time. Something that you might want to do is take a look at the job statistics. So with every job that runs on FME Flow, we do note the statistics of that job. Particularly what you'll want to look at is the CPU time versus the elapsed time. The CPU time is the time that we're spending processing this data. The elapsed time is the time that we're spent waiting for things to occur. So like waiting for that data to arrive. One thing you might note on this job is there is that CPU percentage, which is the CPU time divided by the elapsed time, and that's fairly low. That's sitting around 30%. So this job is only actually working and processing that data around 34% of the time. So one thing we might want to look at here is, could our architecture be better, and could we deploy our engine closer to our data? Let's say this job is reading data from a big geodatabase file that's sitting on a different server somewhere. Maybe that server isn't in the same region as where our FME Flow is deployed. These are things we want to look at and think about if we're seeing bad latency when it comes to running our jobs. The second thing you could look at is getting more into parallel processing. So the kind of criteria you're looking at here is a large job taking a long time to run, and do you have multiple engines? If both of these things are true, you could look at potentially parallel processing your workspaces. So breaking up your workspaces, so instead of processing all your data with one big chunk, you can break it up and process smaller chunks. In the past, I've done this with where clauses. So I have one workspace and all it does is create where clauses. I set that where clause on my reader, and that way I'm only reading in a small portion of the data at a time. Therefore, I'm processing my data more efficiently. And then finally, you can look at embracing queue control. So this is when you're finding you're just often short on your engine time. Maybe you have some quick running jobs that you need to process right away, but the engine is being used by these long running high load jobs. there's something you can do here. You could look at controlling how jobs are sent to your engines. You could look at setting a higher priority for those quick running jobs. You could offload those long running jobs to when outside of your business hours, so you're not processing it during your working hours. There's lots of things you can do with queue control. And again, I have that best practices guide for optimizing jobs, and they really dive into queue control and show you how to set it up there. But just from a very high level, this is our new engine management page. So on the left-hand side here, we can see we have queues. In my case, I only have one, but you could have many queues here. And these queues help you determine what engine runs what job. And we even have something now called active periods, which determines when that queue control or when that job routing rule is actually active. So you can have different rules working at different times to help you get the best optimization out of your FME Flow instance.
All right, thank you so much, Sienna. Next up, we have some questions for Matt here. So the first one is, how do I view FME Flow statistics?
Great, thanks Elizabeth and Sienna. So there's two options in FME Flow for viewing stats. We have customizable dashboards that let you summarize various FME Flow statistics, and we have analytics that let you filter job queue or engine stats. And I've included the documentation for both of these features on this slide. So let's talk about dashboards first. Dashboards are static, so there's no filtering or sorting mechanisms, for example. There's 5 dashboards that come with FME Flow, including the average runtime per workspace that's shown on this slide. But you can create your own by building an FME workspace that writes to HTML. A statistics gathering workspace must first be run. Data in the dashboards is current of when that statistics gathering job last completed successfully. And dashboards are visible to the FME author role as well as admins by default. So let's go over this diagram here and talk about the different components involved in maintaining up-to-date dashboards. So we'll see over on the left here, there's this run job history statistics gathering workspace, and that comes with FME Flow. And you can set up a schedule to run that daily or hourly, whatever your needs are. And that job can also be run on demand. And when that's run, they will write out the data to CSV, the job history data. And it will also trigger a topic, this generate dashboard topic that also comes with FME Flow. And you can use that topic, like Sienna showed earlier, to create your own automation and run any dashboard workspaces you may have, including the ones that come with Flow or custom ones you've built. And those dashboard workspaces need to write out to HTML in a resources dashboards location on FME Flow. And by doing that, you'll be able to go to the jobs dashboard section of the FME Flow web UI and view any dashboards that have run and written out HTML. So now let's talk about analytics. So analytics are different. They're interactive. You can currently graph engine, queue, or job throughput. So you'll see there on the top left of the screenshot, you can pick the type of data you want to graph. And then based on what is graphed, you can filter. So for example, if you're graphing engine throughput, you can filter by the engine name or multiple engines. There are time window and date range filters. Unlike dashboards, this data is live, so there's nothing you need to run beforehand to gather statistics. They're visible only to the FME admin role by default, not authors. And you can't create your own analytics pages like you can with dashboards. But that said, if there are categories you'd like to see here, please do create an ID in the FME community so that our product team can look at improving this feature. It's relatively new to FME Flow. So what do we use this data for? For engine management. So is there too much load on a certain queue or engine? Might need to refine queues or engine assignment rules, or perhaps you could use active hours to push non-critical jobs that get submitted to an after hours queue. You could use this information to refine schedules. So is there too much load at certain times of day due to too many jobs being scheduled at the same time? Can schedules be staggered better? Is there a schedule running more often than it needs to be? Just to provide a real world example, we had a customer recently who identified a workspace that was running at a very high frequency in their environment, multiple times per hour. And they identified that using our analytics tools and found that the data it read was only updated daily. So they worked with that user to switch that to a daily schedule and help relieve some load on their server. And you can find problem workspaces. Which workspaces are running the longest? Is that expected? Are they expected to run long, or are there opportunities for workspace or process optimization like Sienna talked about earlier? So maybe a data set used by a workspace has unexpectedly grown, and now there's an opportunity to look at some parallel processing to bring times down.
All right, fantastic. Our next question here for Matt is, what basic troubleshooting tools should you be aware of as an FME Flow administrator?
Yeah, there's lots to talk about here. We'll talk about 3 categories of tools that can help you analyze problems on FME Flow. FME Flow log files, logging tools. So those would be tools that let you write more information into the FME Flow log files. And system tools. So these would be additional tools that you can use that are external to FME. And these tools are covered in our knowledge base FME Flow debugging toolbox series. So shout out to Sinai, one of our TAs here at SAFE for creating that series, and I've linked it on this slide. So let's start with talking about log files. Reviewing log files is often the first place you're going to go when something fails, especially job logs. So if a workspace fails, you can click on its name in the jobs on the jobs page to view the job log. And here's an example where a workspace has failed, or a job has failed, to be more specific, and it's due to some bad SQL in that workspace. So you may see this log file does not exist error or warning. So a job log won't exist if the job is currently queued. And log files also get cleaned up periodically by FME Flow cleanup tasks. And in that case, a job log entry will still exist on the UI. You can click on it and then you'll see this error because the details are no longer available. So the database record's still there, but the actual log file is no longer available. And if you encounter this and you're not sure where your log files ran, there is a cleanup log in a resources logs location we'll talk about, where you could go see what's been cleaned up and when. So let's talk about automation logs. As of FME Flow 23.2, automation log files can be found under resources logs automations. There are log files for different automation triggers and actions, but you probably want to start by looking at the main FME automations.log file shown here. Now, if you're having issues, you might want to stop that automation and run it in debug mode instead, because this will log everything into a single log file that can be viewed via the automation menu and then view debug log. Makes it a little bit easier for troubleshooting. All log files can be accessed via the web UI under resources logs, as I mentioned earlier. There are too many log files to go through in this webinar, but you want to especially be aware of the FME server core log file, as well as logs core FME Flow functionality. Other core logs regarding the main functionality and configuration of FME Flow, for example, directory server connection issues or backup and restore task logs can be found in the core logs. If you ever need to submit a case to us, and I'm sure many of you have or will, please do include this FME server core log file. And if you have a fault tolerant installation, I'll also mention there could be multiple, or there will be multiple FME server log files, one for each core host server. So again, we can't go through all the different log files in this webinar because there's so many, but just to summarize some of the other logs you'd find on FME Flow, there's engine logs. So those would include the job logs that we already talked about, but also the FME process monitor engine log file, which manages engine processes on the engine host server. So there would, again, in a fault or in a distributed setup and in a fault tolerant setup, you would probably have multiple FME process monitor engine log files. These are also very helpful for package issues. If you have a problem with a package that isn't installing correctly on FME Flow, that's a good log file to check. There's service logs. So these are helpful logs to check for OAuth web connection issues. There's an FME OAuth log in there. There's also SAML and SSO logs. And you'll also find log files for the FME Flow web services like data upload or data download or data streaming. And finally, the Tomcat logs. So Apache Tomcat is FME Flow's default web server. That's the one that we ship with our FME Flow installer. So if your FME Flow is inaccessible or if you're having problems with your web UI, you definitely want to check those Tomcat logs, especially the Catalina log file. Now, if your FME Flow web UI is inaccessible, you're not going to be able to access the logs, obviously, via the web UI, but you can access them via the system share location in that event. So on Windows, the default path is a hidden folder. It's going to be in C program data, safe software, FME Flow, and then you'll see resources logs there. You can access all the logs that you'd access via the web UI. And logs can also be accessed by the FME Flow REST API as well. So just a QA reminder before we look at some more tools. And as we get close to wrapping up our webinar content here, please do submit any questions you have in the questions panel, and we'll have time for Q&A shortly. Okay, let's talk about some logging tools now. So there are tools in FME that can add more information into the log files we just spoke about. The first would be the logger transformer. So if you have a workspace that's failing on FME Flow, try adding loggers before the point of failure to view that feature data in the job log file. There's also a log action in FME Flow automations. So this is very helpful for viewing log messages coming out of triggers and actions. In this example here on the slide, logging the whole message content of a webhook trigger so that I can see what the automation is receiving before I pass that data to a workspace action. There's also a log debug mode in FME, and as of 24.1, you can enable log debug on the FME Flow web UI under advanced options. This can help if you're really stuck, but do be warned, this will log a lot of benign warnings and quote unquote errors as well. So just ignore the quote bad news errors because they're usually, in fact, almost always benign with log debug mode on. And if you're on an older version of FME, so before 24.1, you can still use log debug mode. You just have to enable it in FME Workbench's translation options first, and then publish that workspace up to FME Flow. And then when it's run, after being published that way, log debug mode will be enabled in that workspace. So lastly, there are non-FME tools that you can use for more troubleshooting. In Windows, Task Manager lets you monitor CPU and memory consumption on your FME Flow server. Resource Monitor gives you a more detailed view. There's also Windows Event Viewer. That's not on the slide here, but those can be helpful to check those Windows logs if some other software might be interfering with FME Flow. Using commands in Windows Command Prompt and PowerShell are also helpful. So one example here is for testing port availability. So again, a real world example, we currently have a case where a customer's FME Flow job queue service is not starting. So we have port documentation and we know what port is required by FME Flow to communicate on to the job queue. So they check their error logs first. They see that FME Flow can't connect to the queue. And so we use this command, this test net connection, to see if their FME Flow server can talk to itself on 6379, which is the port used for our job queue. And in this example on the screenshot here, we see TCP test succeeded true. In the customer's case, it was failed. So they have to go back to their IT and networking team and talk about adding a firewall rule or find out why that port is blocked on their server. So lastly, there's your browser's developer tools. This is useful to get more information about errors or perhaps the lack thereof on the web UI. So if you're using Chrome, F12 will open it. Otherwise, you can right-click and choose Inspect. So you want to perform an action after opening DevTools, and then you'll be able to check the Network tab in DevTools for details and more information about an error message. Okay, so let's wrap things up so we have time for some QA. So a big part of FME Flow governance is defining roles, responsibilities, policies, and procedures that Richard talked about earlier that work for your organization. So that's going to help keep your FME Flow server clean and operating well, especially using roles, knowing who can do what, and managing permissions at the role level instead of the individual user level. System events can notify you when important events occur, and reviewing statistics through dashboards and analytics can help you use engine management to optimize your FME Flow instance. With regards to troubleshooting, we just talked about log files and other tools that can help you. And there's lots of information in our knowledge base, the debugging toolbox I just shared, and this article that's linked on this slide, Getting Started with FME Flow Administration. That's going to link to a whole bunch of other information about administering FME Flow beyond what we could discuss in this webinar. And if you're still stuck, by all means, ask the FME community. There's probably someone who's run into the problem you're having before, and we have a large community that can help. If you're still stuck after that, you can always submit a case. We'll work with you. Okay, I'll pass it back to Elizabeth now just to wrap things up.
Excellent, thanks, Matt. All right, so before we dive into Q&A here, just a few resources to help you get started and further your learning here. So we have lots of great upcoming and on-demand webinars. So check those out, safe.com/webinars. And then as well, we do have free instructor-led training through our academy. So academy.safe.com, and our knowledge base. Lots of how-tos and demos as well that are available. Additionally, we have our peak of data integration coming up this next May in 2025. Abstracts are due next month for this event. So if you do have a story that you would be interested in sharing, please do get that submitted. There is a special speaker rate as well for accepted talks. In terms of next steps to take, we would love to chat with you about anything data. So do get in touch with us at info@safe.com. If you have any inquiries, we'd love to help you find a solution. And then also experience the FME Accelerator. If you are newer to FME, I'd encourage you to take a look at this course. It's 90 minutes, it's free of charge. I've personally taken it and found it to be quite valuable. All right, and as a thank you for joining us here today, we do have a community badge code that you can redeem if you are a part of the FME community. I will drop that in the chat here as well. And if you aren't a member of the community, there is the link to join today. Check it out. Lots of other users available in the community that you can network with, and experts alike, and then also get any answers to any questions that you might have. Lots of solutions available in the community. And lastly, I'll just make a shameless plug for we have a special community webinar that will be coming up in December. Stay tuned for an invite for that. All right, with that, we still have 15 minutes remaining here for some Q&A, so I'll invite our presenters on stage and we can take a look through the questions panel. Thanks everyone for getting questions in as we went through, and Steve and Sanai and Chris for getting to a lot, if not all of them, during the webinar. That's awesome. Looks like there might be a couple. Do we want to elaborate on any, pick any out to discuss more, team?
The SAML one, Darren had a SAML question about, so when you import a SAML user, they have to sign in to create the user account, and you can assign the default role to that, but they have to sign in first time before then if you want to adjust the permissions because they need more or less. So based on today's webinar, we can do some things to help automate that if you want. If on the IDP side in SAML, it has a group or some way of noting how the permissions should be set, then you can create a system event when a user logs on for the first time and then finds out that attribute through the attribute mapping in FME and then assigns it a specific role. So there are ways to get dynamic around that. So when they log on for the first time, they can dynamically set this role in the back end by creating the workspace through a system event.
Yeah, there's some recent ones that have come in, so maybe we could try and answer them live here. This one here from Chelsea, we're just starting to explore the user setup options in Flow. As Active Directory approach would be software version dependent. So it depends which Active Directory I think you're referring to. So there's Azure Active Directory, and then there's also Windows Active Directory for integrated Windows authentication. But yeah, we do have documentation on both approaches and how to set them up. There are certainly more, I think there's a few more considerations for the Windows Active Directory side of things, making sure that the ports you need are open and that the domain controller is configured correctly. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that one, Richard.
Yeah, I think just having a good idea of what you want to do with it, because sometimes transferring users from one authentication type to another can be difficult. So rules, again, are very helpful in this process. If they're set there, then you don't have to worry about the permissions again. What you want to do for the long term is going to help a lot. So if you're moving towards Azure Active Directory from LDAP, we see a lot of customers doing that, or towards SAML, maybe try to jump the gun and get moving on that first before you move into the LDAP.
Definitely.
What about this one? How often should we create a backup?
I agree. Yep. And
Sorry.
oh, no, that's okay. I was going to say, I believe we have a schedule that ships with FME Flow for doing that. It's just not enabled. You just want to make sure to enable that so that you can schedule your backups.
Mm-hmm. It really depends on how often new material is being added to your FME Flow. And if someone were to say, go in and delete things on your FME Flow, how stuck would you be between your backups? And think about it that way. Worst case scenario, something happens, a user accidentally deletes things. What would your recovery time look like? How would you miss the content that's in between those backups? I don't really see a downside to doing it quite frequently. I'm not sure if you have anything to add there, Richard.
No, I think frequently is good. I think it depends also if you have a disaster recovery scenario, because that is the recommended method for disaster recover. Could be more frequent than that, and then you could have your own processes. FME can go delete out the old ones if you want to do that to minimize the amount of files or on the whatever system you put onto. So we recommend a file share.
Can we expect 24.2 to be out by the end of this year? I think, yeah.
Yeah.
I would be surprised if it's not out quite soon. Does anyone know about this one? I've never tried setting those up.
Yes, they do set. Yeah, they do work. I've set that up, and you can minimize the amount of data that you have in the engine results folder by setting these. The cleanup tasks can work for that as well, but they're still active, those two parameters. And sorry for the context there, those two parameters allow you to automatically clean up those directories. So it could be like data download, whatever your service is. Every time the engine restarts, it'll go through there and clean it up.
This is one that I thought it might be worth discussing. So when you create items in FME Flow, like a schedule or an automation, you own that item and you need to choose who you want to share it with. And this person's asking, is it possible to automatically give access to all members of the role of author? I don't know if it is. believe you
You'd
need to
have-
share it.
You'd have to do something through the REST API. So you could use a system event, hook that up to a workspace making a REST API call to share it that way. But I don't believe we have anything automatically. Any input, Richard?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. And you'd have to have the logic in there. So if your publishing owner was a member of X role, then potentially you could pull that out and then assign those roles based upon that. And as an admin, you'd have to set that up.
That's all the questions we have.
Yeah, I think they all look to be answered. So perfect. This is a good time to note if you do have any questions that come to mind. We will keep things running for a few more minutes, at least until the end of the hour, just in case anything else comes up. We'll keep an eye on the chat there. But yeah, for now, it does look like we have answered all the questions. So I will wrap us up here. Thanks everyone so much for joining us here today, whether it's the morning, the afternoon, the evening for you. We really appreciate your time. And as well to Sienna, Matt, and Richard for all your time in preparing today's content. We really appreciate it. To our audience, if you do have a moment to fill out our webinar survey, we really appreciate any feedback. It helps us keep improving on our program. And also shout out to Steve and Sinai and Chris on the back end here today, joining us and helping with Q&A. Thanks everyone, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.